Hey, what is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe, host of the Dr. Vibe Show and also producer. As always, I like to say you're blessed and highly favored. You're a magnet for miracles and you're a solution for someone's problem. I am jacked about this conversation tonight. It was the vision I had a few months ago, and I'm very blessed to have, I thought about this term before I came live, three social justice warriors on our show tonight. And we're going to be talking about black men and the North American criminal justice system. And this is going to be unique because a lot of times mainstream media doesn't look at it from both sides of the border. And we relate with each other on both sides of the border. And you're going to find out a lot of interesting things tonight about the similarities that black men face in Canada, in the United States, and just with the criminal justice system in general. So I'm going to first off introduce our wonderful panel tonight. First off, we have Khalil Cumberbatch. He'll do a little introduction on himself. So go ahead, Khalil. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me again on the show. It's always an honor to be on the Dr. Vibe show in any capacity, but it's definitely an honor to be here with my fellow co-panelists. So my name is Khalil Cumberbatch. I am a criminal justice advocate in New York City, USA. I work at a non-for-profit organization called the Legal Action Center, and what we do is we focus on policy and litigation for discrimination for anyone who has had any form of criminal justice involvement, who is HIV and AIDS positive, and or has some history of substance use. I myself am formerly incarcerated. I served 6.5 years in the New York State prison system and was released in 2010.
Excellent. Next up, this gentleman's been on the show a lot over the years, and I've never regretted it, especially I'm going to prop up his last appearance on the Dr. Vibe show. He was at another level, and I kept on saying it during our conversation, and I know he's not going to disappoint tonight. Great filmmaker, great husband, Ramon Hamilton. Ramon, welcome again.
Yes, and thank you once again for having me on and for facilitating this fantastic panel. So for those that are new to my story, a filmmaker based here in Los Angeles, California, started a company called Think 10 Media Group, which essentially we use the power of storytelling, mostly through scripted work, but occasionally through documentaries, to really highlight stories that get overlooked. Portions of our society that go overlooked. There's the leader of the founder of Just Leadership USA, who's Khalil's part of that cohort. He says something about sharing the voices of those who've been silenced. And that's really that I think that really speaks to what we do. And our tagline is we're trying to humanize those that are no longer being humanized. So our first film we did focused with immigration, which is still a very serious topic here in the United States as well as globally. Now for the past 2+ years we've been focused on this project that focuses on mass incarceration, solitary confinement, and just really the overall criminal justice system here in the United States. So I mean, this is a perfect topic for literally the work that we're currently doing right now.
Excellent. Next up, we've got Anthony Morgan, who's become a regular on our show from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Passionate warrior, especially when it comes to issues like police carding in Toronto, which hopefully he'll have a chance to share with our worldwide audience tonight. So, Anthony, welcome again. Come on and share with us.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show again. It's an honor to be on this distinguished panel with Khalil and Ramon. I look forward to bringing a Canadian perspective to bring some light to the issues in the ways we don't always get to talk about. So it's great to be on the panel. I am a lawyer. I'm a human rights lawyer at the African Canadian Legal Clinic. And so the African Canadian Legal Clinic has been around for some 20 years, working to eliminate systemic anti-black racism as it manifests within policy institutions, within the law, within our general society in Canada. And so I've joined the organization not too long ago, but it's given me the opportunity to do some really positive work as it relates to racial justice and specifically issues affecting the African Canadian community.
Fantastic, gentlemen. So let's get right into it. What is the state of the criminal justice system and black men as we're sitting right now June 23rd, 2015 in your respective countries. So I'm actually going to have Anthony start first. So Anthony, what is your take right now for the state of black men and the criminal justice system in Canada?
When I think about the question, the first thing I think about it actually is a quote by I think it's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains. Given the current state of black men in Canada and across North America, I would say black men are born free, but they are everywhere in chains. And what I'm getting at is that there's a hyper-criminalization of black men almost upon being born. We find ourselves labeled with a number of identifiers that would prime us for incarceration. So we're going right from sometimes upon birth, child welfare. We might be put in child protection that could lead us to our first charge, or we can be criminalized in our schools and find us quickly in the criminal justice system, or just the communities that we live in because of broader issues, socioeconomic disparity and want and disadvantage, and that also can lead us to have heightened attention put on us by the police, again facilitating our entry into the criminal justice system. So again, I would say we're in a situation where, yeah, we're born with in law certain freedoms, but ultimately when it comes down to it, the criminalization, the anti-black criminalization is so rife that it's leading so many of our brothers to be locked up unnecessarily and inappropriately in the justice system, to the profit of other communities. And I hope we get the opportunity to talk about that, because that's really real.
Okay, good stuff. Ramon, you have recently started a great web series called The Whole, and I definitely promote that, and people do take a look at it. It's strong, it's powerful, and more episodes to come. What are your thoughts you'd like to share with the audience right now about criminal justice and black men in your country, America, at this time?
Sadly, I mean, basically everything Anthony just said. I mean, it pretty much mirrors what Anthony just said. I think the biggest difference, and it's great to actually hear a perspective from another country, even though, yes, part of North America, but I think the biggest difference now is that, if you obviously, unless you live in a closet, or hiding under a rock, I mean, you turn on the news, you see that there's a spotlight, that has been, focused on America, focused on mass incarceration, focused on the criminalization of black communities and black men specifically. You see, countless black men literally just getting shot, some literally fleeing with their backs to police, and, right now, actually, I just finished the third draft of my episode 2 of The Whole, and we actually are introduced to a 16-year-old kid who's in isolation. And, you go to other places in the country, they're going to be like, what? Like throwing some teenager in isolation? Well, yeah, sorry, that's what happens, and it happens on large scale. So, it's not rocket science. I mean, obviously, communities of color have been disenfranchised since the start of this country. I mean, that's how this country was founded, was off of the backs of others. And, sadly, we continue to do that and profit off it, not just financially, but in other ways. And so, it's a system that, honestly, it's been around for so long, I honestly don't know exactly how to break it, how to stop it. But I am glad that at least here in the U.S., there's starting to be a spotlight, and my hope is that people can, more and more people can continue to be a part of this conversation, and to expose some of these realities of prison, of the mass incarceration of our criminal justice system in general, and just I mean, God, I can go off forever, but the point is, the system's broken on every single level, and it doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be torn down and built anew. And sadly, that's what it sounds like is going on over there in Canada as well. I haven't heard about it because there hasn't been really much of a spotlight, to be honest with you. So that's kind of eye-opening for me. So I appreciate that, Anthony.
Good stuff. Khalil, your thoughts, the state of the criminal justice system in regards to black men at this time, because you did spend time as part of that system. And I guess on another level, too, I want to get your thoughts on where it stands out. And has it gotten any better? Is it getting any worse? Or is it still the same from the time you had to spend involved in that system in prison?
So it definitely has not gotten better. I think we can, at minimum, say that it has remained the same If we look back 30 years ago, we can undoubtedly say that that it has gotten worse. Right now in the U.S., we incarcerate 2.3 million people. And out of that 2.3 million people, 1.7 million of them are black men. So when we ask the question, what is the state of the criminal justice system in the U.S., sadly, I mean, that's the one component that is missing from this system is justice. More importantly, to place it in some context, when we talk about the criminal justice system, I think most people, at least from the work that I do, both professionally and personally, kind of automatically connotate that to prison and jail. But what we're really talking about are a myriad of systems, and we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about the court system, we're talking about the district attorneys, we're talking about communities, we're talking about families, we're also talking about jails and prisons. So once we place it in that context, we understand that when someone gets choked to death by officers, that is inclusive of the criminal justice system. When we understand that people are being imprisoned because they can't pay a certain amount of debt, we understand that that's part of the criminal justice system. When we understand that women, just as much as men, are being assassinated in the U.S. by law enforcement, we understand that that is also part of the criminal justice system. So John Legend recently, at his acceptance speech of an Oscar award that he won, said that there are currently more black men under some form of supervision than there was in the 1850s in chattel slavery. And that is the epitome of where we're at in terms of the criminal justice system in the United States. As I mentioned, out of the 2.3 million folk that we incarcerate in the U.S., 1.7 million of that are black men.
Excellent. Well, I know that before we came on live, Ramon wanted to discuss the media's role in all this, and I think let's get right into it right now. So, Ramon, you wanted to talk about the media's role in regard to the current
your audio was going in and out there. I lost a little bit of it.
No problem. No, just can you hear me okay now?
Okay.
Okay, no, you wanted to make sure that we discuss about the media's role in regards to this situation, and you know, well, let's get right into it right now, and then Khalil and Andy can certainly join in too. You being a filmmaker, you are involved, your business, your life is media. What is your thought, or what are your thoughts in regards to the media when it comes to this subject?
Ooh, you know, I think this circles back to the foundation of this country. You know, it was founded on racism. It was founded on slavery, built off of the blacks of slaves, right? That's and the suffrage of others. And what has happened over time is there's been attempts to justify these. You know, back in slave days, you know, they would bring in scientists or whatever that would literally, you know, measure brains and say, look, the brain of the Negro is smaller than that of a white man, and do these things to justify their acts. You know, they're lesser than us, they're not whatever. And now, of course, it's not as severe, but I mean, let's be honest, the way the media since then has developed, I mean, there's always been this very false and skewed depiction of black men as aggressive, as you know, over-sexualized, as you know, just all these very negative traits. And it's done, you know, through our television shows, our films, our magazine advertisements, our radio spots. And this isn't something, you know, that's just now. I mean, this has been literally, you know, since the origin of this country. The media and the way things have been portrayed are this completely false view. But what's so important to understand is we are fools if we think that our minds are not, you know, or how we live our life and how we think is not shaped by the media. If we do not think that, we are absolute fools. If you just look at the way people dress, you know, look at the cars that they have. These are all things that are influenced by commercials, by what they see on shows, by what they, you know, hear on the radio, whatever. Everything that people do is based off of the media that they get in various different forms. And so when you're getting these representations of black men, in all sorts of areas, I mean, that's going to seep into your society and society's psychological way of looking at black men. And it feeds into the so many narratives that then allow for all these black men to get locked up, to get shot, and while just being, simply arrested, and people justify it because they've already in their minds have this perception that, black men are these aggressive, criminals and thugs. I mean, Christ, the president himself referred to them as thugs. I mean, come on, and then you look at someone like Dylan, I always get his name wrong, Roth or Roof, the guy that did the shooting at the church there. Not once has he been referred to as a thug, or a terrorist, unless someone is saying, like, he should be called a terrorist. But the mainstream media isn't referring to him as that. I mean, you have these little subtle word choices and things, but they happen in enough different ways and over enough different time and in so many different manners that just it shapes our perceptions. So what has happened, sadly, is media, in my opinion, has really shaped this nation's perspective that has allowed us as a society as a whole. So I do agree with Khalil. It's not just the prisons and the jails. It's everything. It's just our society in general has bought into this narrative that we've been spoon-fed. I mean, media is powerful. Christ, the United States government produces video games. Think about that. They produce video games. And why would they do that? Because they know young people play video games. It gets them excited about war. It gets them to go overseas and to sacrifice their life. I mean, they're not stupid. You know what I'm saying? That's the power of media, And so it's just been, like, again, in all these different shapes, fashions, and forms over the years, these negative depictions have been ingrained in our brains and have justified these narratives that we're seeing today. That's just my opinion.
No problem, Ramon. I like you're keeping the bar high with your passion, so don't lose it, man. It's good stuff. Anthony, Canadian media, when it comes to this issue. Oh, God, I already see you shaking your head. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. The narrative is the same in terms of the hyper-criminalization of black people, of black communities, that same suggestion that black men are violent, they are a threat, they are dangerous, they are hypersexualized, they are prone to rape, specifically raping white women, or just engaging in all kinds of unpredictable behaviors that requires a hypervigilance by police officers. We do see that in Canada. Folks would probably say it's not to the same degree, but if you look at the over-incarceration and the criminalization of our people, the effect is very much the same, because you have diminished opportunities, diminished chances, and a hyper-acceleration of the black population in Canada, in prison. So in the last 10 years alone, we've seen an increase of the black population in Canadian prisons by 90%. So 10 years alone, 90%. So there is, one might even go as far as to say there is a campaign as it relates to black men, to the black community in Canada. And how does that relate to the media? We have increasing depictions of black people as violent, as criminal, and you have so many more limited depictions of us doing anything productive with our lives, contributing to communities in healthy ways. And so we have this ongoing media cycle that continues to allow us to collectively think that, you know what, prison is actually where black people belong. Anytime you have an issue with a black person, what you need to do is just call the police. Whereas you find for other communities, they'll look to resolve matters in more, I think, respectful, humane ways, more appropriate ways. Immediately, it's almost like collectively we've come to understand that if you want to regulate a black person, just say you're going to call the police. Because as black people, we know what that means. We know how that's tied to a larger construction of things, and we know it's almost always going to go terribly for us.
All right. Khalil?
Yeah, I agree. I would say that media's role in the way that we perceive black skin is it's huge, and in many cases it is vital. Media is very much like a vehicle, right? I mean, they have people who use it recklessly, and you have people who use it very cautiously. People like yourself and like Ramon use it very cautiously and use it very consciously. But the reality is that some of the major conglomerate, quote-unquote, mainstream media, and even some that we would say, lean to the right, have a huge role in the way that we perceive black skin, but particularly how we perceive black men. A prime example is how our mainstream media and mainstream media across the world covered the rebellion that basically happened in Baltimore, and how young people of color, but particularly young men of color, were painted as violent, as painted as rioters, as thugs, as criminals. And within a week or two, there was a mass killing of 9 people by a white biker gang in Waco, Texas, and the media was very reluctant to call them exactly what they were. They were terrorists. They were thugs. There was 9 people that were murdered, almost 20 that were injured. And when the police came to arrest them, they were sitting on the floor texting and checking their Twitter feed and posting on Facebook. But a lot of that comes from the deep-seated belief, not only from current mainstream media but historic media, that says that black skin is innately dangerous, that anyone of a dark complexion is violent, that anyone of a certain hue is inherently stupid or retarded, or they don't know how to behave in public. And unfortunately, not only do we see this from mainstream media, but we also see this within our own communities. There's people who live in our communities, communities that are heavily impacted by some of the socioeconomic issues that lead to criminal justice involvement, that lead to poverty, that lead to lack of education. But yet and still, if they were to see a group of young 16-year-old males, they could be wearing suit and ties walking down the street. There are some people in our own communities who would be fearful, because there's just this belief that young men of color are innately dangerous. And there's countless videos and social experiments that can speak to that actually highlight this point. And unfortunately, we see the same mentality that we advocate against, not only in media outlets like yours and Ramon's, but also in the work that I do and Anthony does. We see that not only from people, quote unquote, on the other side, but we also see it from our own community members.
Okay.
Definitely. If I could jump in really quickly on this point before we move on from talking about the media. Actually, this issue I'm very passionate about in terms of the misrepresentation of black peoples through the media and the impact that has on our communities. I would encourage the watchers and also Khalil and Ramon, if you could check out a document that I drafted called the Universal Charter on Media Representations of Black People.
Yeah, it was a powerful piece. I read it.
So that I'm very passionate about ensuring that there is more balanced perspective on who we are and the complexities of blackness. Right now, we're being so overly reduced to the worst parts of white imaginations, and that's what's being carried as realities through television, through so many different forms that are impacting our community, and it's having very, very serious impacts on our ability to live in dignity and humanity.
And it is a very powerful thing that you shared. And I'm going to ask you live right now. Do you give me permission to post it on the site so people can view it, sir?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Anybody can take advantage of that charter. I hope it can be used as an education tool, as a community building tool, a conversation piece.
Excellent. Khalil, circling back to something you said near the beginning of our conversation, you said that you don't feel the situation is getting any better. Why? Yeah. Why do you feel that? Then I also want Ramon and Anthony to chime in on that. So what was your reason for saying that?
Well, in terms of just the sheer amount of people that we currently incarcerate, if we were to use statistics alone, and if we were to use the determining factor of recidivism, which means that the amount of times that a person circles in and out of a jail or a prison, that number has stayed the same for the past 30 years in the U.S. Nationally, it's 67% of people who are released from a jail and or prison within 3 years will recidivate, which means that they will go back to a jail or prison. If we were to use that as the determining factor of are we being successful, then the reality is that if we can say 2 out of 3 people within 3 years are returning to prison, then I would say that the system is not getting any better. If we were to use that same statistic for the safety of vehicles or for the safety of heart operations, it would be unfathomable that we could walk around and accept the fact that 2 out of 3 automobiles leaving the plant are going to end up with somebody in a fireball on the side of the highway. it would be something that we couldn't even live with, and you may not even have to own that type of vehicle, but it was just something that it speaks to our shared values that we all believe that people should be safe, right? So if we were to use that as a determining factor, we could say that the system is failing. But I would also say that, you know, when we talk about these systems, the reality is that it's very easy to say that the systems are broken, but in all actuality, these systems are working exactly how they were designed to work. The reality is that prison or crime that leads to prison is a symptom of social ills, is a symptom of problems, and in many cases, incarceration does not solve those problems. And we can look at that from a moral perspective, which is the argument that I like to lead with, or we could look at it from a fiscal perspective, which is a perspective that more and more we're seeing people on the quote-unquote left are leaning towards, that we understand that the current system that we have, it just doesn't work. It doesn't work fiscally, it doesn't work morally, and more importantly, it doesn't work generationally. I mean, there are people who live in the United States of America, the country that was founded on freedom, the belief that everyone has the right to freedom, but there are generations, people who go 3 and 4 generations, that incarceration is secondhand knowledge. It's something that just happens in the family's history. And when you have that in any culture tearing at its fabric, it's something that, you know, it's something that doesn't represent our shared values, particularly in the US, where we say that we're a country of the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Ramon, you are very passionate with the area of solitary confinement. In the times or during the journey that you spent looking at solitary confinement in America, are things better, worse, the same? What do you see right now in that area?
Well, I'll speak to solitary confinement, but I also want to piggyback on something.
Sure.
Let me piggyback on what Khalil said, because since that's fresh there. So I think to answer the simple question, you know, has the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, the criminalization of black men, has it gotten better? You know, no. And I'll speak specifically in regards to the prisons. I think until prisons themselves, and not just prisons, the criminal justice system, which obviously encompasses the prisons and jails and so many other assets, until we have a universal system that is truly non-punitive but is rehabilitative, then it's not going to get better. You know, if we continue to try to make reforms within a punitive system, then it's still a punitive system. Does that make sense? And I think that in and of itself is the problem. That's, you know, and Khalil's right. I mean, a punitive system, it's been proven not to work. It does not work. You know, it's like, you know, especially within our prisons, and this will tie into solitary confinement. You know, but you know, you go to prison, which should be a place where you get reformed, should be a place where you get really rehabilitated, taught new skills, and you come out a better person than you were when you went in. That's not happening, because when you get to prison, it's like you're then sentenced again. You know, the sentence itself, the punishment itself is you're going to prison, right? When you're sentenced, that's it. That is your punishment. You're going to prison. Now, while you're at prison, the question is, what do we do with you? You know, and unless I'm overlooking some serious research, I haven't seen anything that really shows that we're doing enough positivity and rehabilitative work within our prisons. And then, of course, when you tie in solitary confinement, which has been, you know, the UN has straight out said this is torture, plain and simple. They say anything more than 15 days in isolation is torture. I've talked to so many people that have been in isolation. Not a single one has been in there less than 15 days. Right? So let's just straight up say we are torturing people by massive numbers in our country. That's what's happening. It's happening. It's happening right now as we speak. So until that stops, of course it's not going to get better. You know. So that's the larger issue. Is the system that we have and the mindset, the psychological mindset that we have to addressing wrong behavior is a very punitive system that gets even harsher once you're behind those cell walls, you know, and then we're blown away that like the recidivism rates are high. I mean, it's not, you know, again, it's not rocket science, it's not calculus. This is very simple, you know, just cause and effect. You know what I'm saying? It's very simple like that. So, you know, now, you know, the bigger problem with that is the current system. And I agree with what Khalil was saying as well as Anthony. I mean, the current system, it does work, you know, for those that put it in place. It definitely works. and it's a well-oiled machine. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't make it right. You know, just because it works well does not make it right. So until I start to see us as a society start to have the true discussions about what is real justice and what is it that we can do to create a rehabilitative type of environment for those that commit, you know, wrong behavior, then no, it's not getting better.
Okay.
Oh, and to top it off, you know, in terms of the, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. You're on fire.
No, I mean, you know, and then there's also now, I mean, we already have 2.3 million people in prison. That's where we're at now. And then when you see like these states that are wanting to build these new prisons, supermax prisons, that are basically nothing but solitary confinement chambers, it's like, what? You know what I'm saying? We already have like the highest rate of incarceration of any place on the face of this world, and yet we want to add more prisons? I mean, well, hello, you built these new prisons, what do you need? You know what I mean? You need more prisoners. That 2.3 million number just keeps going up. So, you know, yeah, it's definitely not getting better. That's for sure.
Anthony,
Yeah.
/ Canadian perspective, since you've been involved in this journey, are things same, better, worse?
From my reading, they're definitely getting worse. So, as Ramon was talking about the building of prisons, so our government actually here in Canada has been in power since I think around 2006, and has been aggressively seeking to build more prisons in the areas of the country where they can gain more votes. Essentially, they're creating employment in pockets around the country to offset the fact that people in larger cities in Canada don't tend to support the current government. But because you have bigger ridings geographically and fewer people in them, votes tend to weigh more. And so prisons are built in those communities. And so you have literal employment being created off of them. And I think we have to look at the connection that has with the hyper-incarceration or the accelerated incarceration of the black population. Again, I said it was from 2003. This government's been in place since 2006, and so they continued the trend, and they accelerated it. If we want to talk about also isolation or segregation, putting people in the hole, for black people alone, the number has gone up since 2005 by 100%. So between 2005 and 2015, the number of, or the rate of black people being put in segregation has gone up 100%. So we have not only the hyper-incarceration, but meting out a particular kind of cold torture, as Ramon mentioned, for this population. Right? And we're not, statistically, and this is reported by the government's own reports, we're not just demonstrating ourselves to be more violent in prison or having more mental health issues or for some reason needing, for some particular peculiarities about blackness, needing to be in isolation. As far as we can see, it really is just a matter of disproportionate targeting of this population for warehousing in isolation. Right? So as far as I've seen, it's certainly getting worse. And we also have to think about it because it's about the prison system, but also the larger systems that interact with that system. We have to be asking ourselves, while we see the increased incarceration and control that black folks are coming under through the criminal justice system, we have to also be looking at what's happening in terms of the funding for social programming, what's happening to funding for housing, for education, for schools, for the kind of social supports that would keep our communities out of the prison system, instead of funding more social workers or addictions counselor or youth justice workers or even sports coaches. What you have is funding for more police. You have this hyper-militarization of our police forces. You know how much it costs for a lot of these armored tanks to drive around the street? You know the opportunities you can create from that? But instead of seeing the more humane things that we can do to support our people in our communities, our governments are selling us out and selling us into prisons to the hands of private profiteers and what I call anti-black profiteering.
Good stuff. Khalil, I hear you going, you have something to share. I can see your mind is turning on the comments.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about the profit that comes from mass incarceration, mass criminalization, we're tapping into a whole nother conversation, right? Like right now what we're having is a conversation about the tip of the iceberg, and we all know that When you go underneath the waters is when you really see how massive the iceberg is. And in the United States, particularly in New York City, our city council just recently passed our budget, and one of the major points was that they're going to include 1,300 more officers. And we're talking about, we're at a point in our city's history where, we're at some of the lowest points in terms of crime, but yet and still the knee-jerk reaction, right? The financial incentive to put more quote-unquote boots on the ground it resonates very clearly with not only politicians but also with private companies that are going to make a ton of money. When we talk about mass incarceration and the profiteering off of it, when we talk about closing a jail, when we talk about decreasing a prison population, there's correctional officers unions, there's law enforcement unions that are going to fight that tooth and nail. And how do they fight that? They fearmonger. They use two people who may have escaped from one maximum security prison, and they use that as a way to justify overtime. They use that as a way to justify further perpetuating the idea that people who are incarcerated are savages, are animals, and are innately evil and cannot be fixed, quote unquote, fixed in any way. And when we also talk about criminal justice reform, we need to be talking about what happens on the back end. Speaking to a point that Ramon mentioned, we could give people in prison all the resources that they need to come home and lead productive lives. But the reality is that when you come home and you apply for a job, and one of the first questions you're asked right after you're asked your name and maybe your address is, have you ever been convicted of a felony offense? And if you have to check yes, that only feeds a certain stereotype that this information, the fact that you have been convicted of a felony, is so important that we need to know that right away. And what happens is, unfortunately, most people who totally are unaware of what the criminal justice system really means and what involvement in it really means, automatically assume, well, because you've been convicted of a felony, you're innately wrong and ultimately unfixable. But the reality is that we're not asking those questions for people like Martha Stewart, right? I mean, for all intents and purposes, she is someone who has been convicted of a felony offense. But people almost always forget about that, right? Because the reality is that she has access to a certain level of privilege, she has access to a certain level of resources, and she doesn't fit the narrative. And what is that narrative? Like I said, there's 1.7 million men of color sitting in a prison cell right now in the United States of America.
Powerful stuff. Powerful stuff. I want to look at, and this issue has come up a little bit in Toronto recently, carding, which is, I guess, comparable to profiling in the United States. For those who are living in the United States, and Anthony can also give an update on what's going on in Canada, or in Toronto anyways, where does this racial profiling issue stand right now? Because I haven't heard a lot about stop and frisk, etc. in the U.S. Is it gone away? Is the media not making a lot of it? Are police, and just a generalization, are they still carrying on with this practice at this time? And what is it going to take for it to be pulled away in America, in Canada?
If I could speak to that, racial profiling is still very much a part of the way policing is done within Canada. We actually, at the African Canadian Legal Clinic, we just recently won a case. The decision came down just last week, Monday, talking about racial profiling in the nation's capital, which is Ottawa. We were pushing for a study of racial profiling that would look at the problem holistically, but they only wanted to look at limited parts of it, looking only at stops of individuals in cars without considering that a significant amount, if not the majority, of stops between police and community members happens when folks are just walking. They're not in vehicles. So that's just one small example, but definitely racial profiling is a part of policing, and it continues to be. And again, I don't think we can imagine that it's stopped when we're looking at the hyper-incarceration or the accelerated incarceration of our community. They are intimately connected. They are necessarily connected because the way in which over-surveillance, over-policing of our communities leads to us having this disproportionate contact that, again, facilitates our warehousing in the prison industrial complex. That's a part of reality here in in Canada for Black folks, but also I should mention we have a significant Aboriginal population or Indigenous population, or what you might call Native population. And so Black and Natives, we are several orders of magnitude more incarcerated than the rest of the population. We are the fastest growing population, while the white population actually continues to decrease. Year after year, you have an increase of Black and Aboriginal people within our criminal justice systems, and increase of policing within our communities. And so it's, racial profiling is an intimate part of that horrible calculus that's destroying our communities.
Yeah, and I would also just add right onto the back of that you know, if we want to look any further in terms of a current event that unfortunately happened, we could look at the case of Freddie Gray, who was in Baltimore, Maryland, who was essentially profiled. I mean, he was stopped, well, actually he was chased, and the lieutenant actually said that the reason why they stopped him was because he looked at one of the officers and began to run. But what that really speaks to, you know, the real question is not what he was hiding, you know, if he was hiding anything. The reality is that most men of color in most low-income, impoverished, socioeconomically damaged communities look at law enforcement as the enemy. And it's not in a combative way, but it is in a fearful way. The fact that Freddie Gray had to flee shows you, it speaks to the fact that his perception of any interaction with law enforcement could ultimately lead to his death, and that's essentially what happened to him. So, you know, also historically, you know, law enforcement comes right off the back of these gangs that basically used to run around looking for runaway slaves. And the current law enforcement structures that we have in many cases throughout this country, but also throughout the world, basically mirror that, right? That in most cases law enforcement is not reflective of the same socioeconomic status, they're not reflective of the same race, they're not reflective of the same culture. And most people who end up going into law enforcement in New York City in particular do not live in the 5 boroughs. You know, New York City is a city that composes of 5 counties. But the reality is that most law enforcement officers that patrol New York City streets don't live in the New York City area, and more importantly, they don't come from that culture. While there is a certain segment of the law enforcement population that actually does grow up in those neighborhoods, that actually understands the culture, that segment is a small sliver. And the reality is that the majority of law enforcement officers, when you don't speak the language, so to speak, when you don't understand the culture, when you're taught to believe that everyone outside of blue is considered to be an enemy and a threat, and is innately dangerous, then that's how you basically are going to interact with the community. And what we're seeing now and throughout the world basically is that law enforcement in many cases takes the form of occupiers and not collaborators. Right? Most people in any community don't want crime, but the knee-jerk reaction is always, well, we need more police officers. But again, crime is just a symptom of an underlying problem, and putting more boots on the ground, particularly boots that don't respect cultures, don't really care to respect cultures, don't even understand it, or let alone may even have a tinge of racism in their blood, then the reality is that, you know, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Ramon, when you, and I'm making an assumption that you do in your journey and travels, get to talk to law enforcement, lawyers, people in the system, do any of them get it?
Say that again. Did anyone what?
No, just when you speak with people in either law enforcement, criminal justice, do you ever get people who understand what your heart shares and your passion, or most of them just code, like just taking the code for lack of a better term?
You know, that's where it gets insanely complex. The short answer is yes. I've talked to, and in fact, just last week I was speaking with a correctional officer who's based in Boston, Massachusetts. She's actually been doing it for 29 years. She's a person of color, black female, you know, we actually connected through Facebook a couple years ago, and she is very much, you know, on the Black Lives Matter movement. She's very much with that, and she's posting and sharing and, you know, things like that. But I spoke with her specifically because I needed to get a correctional officer's perspective on the whole. I want to make sure that all voices are actually being heard. And it was at that point that I felt that there was a disconnect, and it was what I could see, especially for someone who's doing this for just about as long as I've been alive, is that there's a certain I guess a manuscript that has been delivered to these employees, these staff, and this branches out even into the police officers, not just correctional officers within the prison walls. And they're basically told what it is they need to do, and more importantly, why they need to do it. But what came from that conversation is essentially within prison. This isn't necessarily speaking outside. To justify a punitive system, she basically explained it to me that her job is to make prison something that these young men, especially men of color, because she's in the city of Boston, so she's, again, the Boston prisons or the Massachusetts prisons are predominantly men of color. They come here and experience a situation that makes them never want to come back here again. That's essentially, the root of it. She does not believe that, if we work with them, if we do this and that, basically true rehabilitation. She's not necessarily, she's not saying that, like, oh, we shouldn't try that. She feels like, that's been tried, it hasn't worked, and so hence, we just want to make sure that this, some 18-year-old kid comes to prison, they get, oh shit, prison is scary as hell, I'm never coming back. She's a fan of the show. I don't know if you are familiar with Locked Up, or what is it? No. It's Scared Straight. Where they take these young kids and they bring them into prison, and basically they just scare the hell out of them, and that's what she feels works, But obviously, it doesn't work, But again, why that type of system is justified, I think, is again, it's a deep-seated, just I don't know, it's extremely complex, But it really, I think, there's issues that tie with that, that also tie with profiling, Hey, for example. I lived a very, very unique experience growing up. I lived in Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is predominantly African American. And I went to school in Belmont, Massachusetts, which is probably one of the whitest whitest towns in America. Literally where the presidential nominee Mitt Romney lives in Belmont, Massachusetts. All right. Now, the way that happened is there was a program that basically took inner city kids and they bust them out to the suburbs to get so-called better education. All right. So I literally got to see these parallels as I grew up. And this was from second grade all the way through basically even college. I got to see these parallels, and when I would step into my own community in Dorchester, there's police everywhere. Where they're driving or standing by the street corner talking to Joe Schmo, it's just happening. Not only that, but there's also, just for me, it was normal to see people get locked up. Got neighbors getting locked up left and right. I mean, it was nothing was abnormal about that, which is scary. But when a kid sees that all the time, that coupled with media narratives, it's like, oh, well, that's just how it's supposed to be. Now, contrast that by going out to Belmont, Massachusetts. I mean, good luck, drive around and try to find a police officer. I mean, good luck, They're just not out there patrolling. They're not out doing this, And I think even with those officers and within those systems, it's these deep-seated ideas that, like, black communities are rough and they're aggressive and there's just always this and there's always that. And there's media narratives and stories to back that up and support that. So psychologically, you know what I mean? You have these officers, like Khalil was saying, they don't even necessarily need to live in Boston, but they work for the Boston Police Department. They're coming in there. They already have this ingrained perception of the community that they're policing, and that community is an aggressive community. It's a community that they have to be on alert. They have to watch out for these guys. They have to, and be tough. But when they go into the suburban communities, oh, it's different. That's not there. These are white communities. These are white people. That's not going to be an issue. And so there isn't this over-policing of those communities. So, I mean, again, like I said, it's very complex. But I do think so much of it, again, just has to do with how we have portrayed communities of color, black men, since the founding of this country, and then these other extensions of it that support and allow for this type of thinking. I don't think most police officers wake up in the morning and say, like, how much evil stuff can I go out and do today, you know? But you have a situation where good people end up doing bad things, you know, just like a CO who I don't agree with her opinions, but I empathize and I see where she's coming from, and I see why she's able to justify her actions. You know, there's been so many things that have been crossed across her plate throughout her life experiences that have basically justified the needs for her to be tough on criminals, to make sure that, you know, prison is hard, it's tough, and that when you get out of here, you're never going to want to come back. That's what she believes. There's a narrative that supports that.
Okay, Anthony, in your journey in this area, have you met anyone from criminal justice or law that understands this issue and understands how serious an issue it is and gets it, so to speak?
Yeah, certainly there have been folks along the way here and there who've, we can say, appreciate some of the issues, but when it comes down to it, we're talking about systemic problems. It's, as Ramon was saying, and as Khalil had mentioned, it's embedded in the very ways in which police operate, embedded in the very ways in which prisons are run, in a way that you see the inmates, or you see people in certain communities as always potential suspects. So yeah, you will have, you might even have police chiefs who will acknowledge positive things about what needs to be done to increase or enhance relationships between community and people. But I think we need to move away from this bad apples narrative. It's not a bad apple narrative, it's a bad orchard, right? The entire system, based on its fundamental principles, is corrupt in terms of the way in which it targets people to draw them in, and then creates a system that has to justify itself by grabbing more people within it and maintaining it, as opposed to being embedded with some of the programs and services that would genuinely make it a one-time stop, where people would come into that system and not forever be regulated or pushed out of society, essentially, because they can't vote, because they can't get access to certain social services because of the criminal record or time that they did. Yes, a quick answer, yes, certainly I've seen folks who do get it, but it's because the system is so corrupt. It's not enough to have 1, 2, or even 10 officers or correctional officers, or even politicians who get it, because the system in and of itself operates to warehouse people. Policing in and of itself, it has to justify its actions by finding people. And if I could say quickly, within Toronto, what this has looked like is a system that is like stop and frisk, but here we call it carding, where officers, without a legitimate reason, can approach individuals, stop them, question them, without the right to do so, and warehouse their information in a database. So the justification they use for this is, oh, there could be a potential incident where we need to find out who is who in the community. Actually, the chief of the Toronto Police Service, who's a black man, he was recently hired in that position, and historically he is Toronto's first ever black chief. He literally said that this practice I just referred to as carding, so stopping, questioning, and warehousing information of individuals' data, he said that it is effective to, quote, figure out who is who in the zoo, end quote. So this is the chief of police of Canada's largest city, what we often say is the most diverse city. And yeah, there are a lot of positive things, but when you have that kind of individual at the head of policing who's going to say that to a national newspaper, that's where he actually used that quote, it doesn't bode well for our communities. And carding, he has actually maintained that it is an effective practice, although there's never been any evidence to suggest that it actually effectively does what it does, or it's consistent with human rights practices that we have here, or human rights law, sorry, that we have here in our country.
Khalil, you're in your journeys, have you met people in this criminal justice system, whatever avenue, who understand the seriousness of this situation?
Totally. I think that particularly in the U.S., we're at a very unique time in terms of the conversation around criminal justice reform. I think that you're having people who 10 years ago would have never been on this issue. In the United States, the Koch brothers who are multi-billionaires and have funded primarily Republican candidates for presidency, and have some very unique views on not only criminal justice reform, but a slew of other issues, have recently said that criminal justice reform is not only one of the issues that they are looking for candidates to speak to, but more importantly, one of the primary issues. So we're at a very unique time in our country's history, particularly when it comes to criminal justice reform. In my work that I do, I come across people all the time who say that they totally do understand that the system that we have is not working in the way that is reflective to our values. However, and even as someone who served time in the New York State prison system, I know for a fact that those people are just as disempowered as the people who are on the bad receiving end of those policies. So I've had long conversations with correctional officers, both as someone who was incarcerated and both after my time. And they themselves understand that, look, this system doesn't work. It doesn't work to keep people out. But the reality is that they themselves are disempowered. So in order for true reform to really take hold, what we really need to do is stop putting blame on the individuals. And that includes the people who commit crimes. So it's easy for someone to say, well, if you can't do the time, then don't do the crime. But the reality is that that's a flawed perception, and it totally lets the systems that lead to crime, that don't provide adequate safety nets, that ultimately lead to crime as one issue, that we need to hold those systems accountable. So when we talk about a correctional officer, or even correctional officers, or even one state, talking about that we need to do something better, we need to then pull the lens back and say, well, what can we do better as a country? What can we do better as a nation? You know, what can we do better as neighbors, right? And until we reach that tipping point where we're having a conversation about how do we hold systems accountable and how do we give people access to the resources, because it's not that those resources don't exist. Like, we're talking about, you know, two of the most resource-rich countries in the world. Believe me, if we had the political will tomorrow to end what we now know as mass incarceration, it could literally almost happen overnight. But the reality is that most policymakers, most politicians are fearful of their constituents, fearful of their national perception, fearful of their local perception, of how they would look on quote-unquote crime, right? In New York City, for example, the head of our city council wants to implement what is called a bail fund. And essentially what that means is people who have low-level nonviolent offenses, who have low bails, that the city would put up the bail to get them out of the system because it costs more money on the back end to keep them in the system. There was a tremendous amount of flack that came from that. And that was for quote-unquote low-level nonviolent offenses. Until we start having conclusive conversations that include everyone, including people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes, and how do we give those people the access to the resources that they need to not only become better people, but to actually actualize that when they leave prison, then we're falling short of true reform.
Well, I was, as we wind down here, I was going to ask for final thoughts. I think Khalil just gave a good final thought right there. So, Khalil, before I pass on to get Ramon and Anthony's final thoughts, how can people contact and connect with you?
So, anyone that wants to learn more about the work that I do at the agency, the Legal Action Center, you can visit our website at lac.org. That's lac.org. I'm actively on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is at Kha Cumberbatch, at Kha Cumberbatch.
Excellent. Ramon, final thoughts again. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule, positive, productive schedule, to be with us. Give us some final thoughts and how people can connect with you.
Sure. Well, I think one final thought that I was just reflecting on, particularly, and Khalif even used the word fearful quite a few times there, is I think the power of fear has, or the power of the tool that is fear, is something that also needs to be looked at quite a bit. It is a tool that has been used to justify so many injustices here in our country. And I can't speak to Canada because I don't know the history of it. But you think back to these beastly images of black men, and so you create this fear. You think back to World War II and the propaganda, news clips that you would see in the movie theaters. It created this fear. After 9/11, and even pre-9/11, the way that we view the Arab world and the way they're presented, we fear. We've created enough different ways to show and justify why we need to fear black men. And so once that is justified, then it's easy for us to kind of turn a blind eye when they are over-criminalized and sent into prison systems in mass numbers. We psychologically justify that because enough fear of that population has been instilled in us. And I think, you know, to not address the way that fear is used as a tool in this country is an injustice to the conversation. No pun intended. But I think once we start to look at it from that lens, then we can actually maybe start to see the realities and not these false and skewed, you know, information and presentations of information that have been given to us. So you know, I think that's something that absolutely needs to be looked at. I wish, you know, we talked about that a little earlier, but it just came to me as Khalil was talking. But I think, you know, fear, it's a powerful tool, and, you know, that one quote, "There's nothing to fear except fear itself," rings so true even today. So, and in terms of how people can reach me and learn more about the work that we do, they can go to our website, which is think10mediagroup.com. That's THINK, 10 spelled out, TEN, mediagroup.com. Again, think10mediagroup.com. They can check out the pilot episode of The Whole. We're working on episode 2 that's filming next month. All of our contact information is there. There's also resources for those that, you know, want to feel empowered and want to get engaged. There's a couple of organizations that we have listed on there. Click their stuff, check them out, and get engaged, and you know, hopefully, you know, add your voice to the movement.
Excellent. And finally, Anthony Morgan.
Yeah, so in terms of final thoughts, I think, well, I'm happy to have had the opportunity to participate in this important conversation and bring to light some of the issues that we're seeing here in Canada. And the issues are the same. Again, the scale may be a bit different, but in terms of the impact, the proportion of black folk caught up in the system is right on par, and in many instances actually worse, because our issues are not being talked about on this level. I think when we're looking at the question of mass incarceration, we do really need to be thinking seriously about how we are, at the end of the day, spending our money. Does it make sense to have, quote-unquote, more boots on the ground or giving these officers more money, but we could be creating more breakfast programs, and we could be buying more books for our schools, or we could be increasing minimum wages, creating opportunities and jobs for our communities, buying sports equipment for teams, renovating fields so young people can play, making more healthy environments, creating increased access to good, healthy food so our young people aren't suffering from the levels of obesity, and our communities at large aren't suffering from these things. And so we can direct our funds, as Khalil was saying, if we came together as a people, if we seriously pushed for saying, you know what, enough is enough. Policing may have its place, but it's overstretched significantly. We're relying too heavily on this very punitive and problematic institution to do a lot of the things that we can help vent within our society. And so we at the African Canadian Legal Clinic continue to do this work. If you want to learn more about us and the work we do here in Canada on these issues, you can reach us at online at aclc.net, N-E-T. You can also reach me on Twitter at Anthony N. Morgan. I look forward to hearing from you.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for making a dream of mine come true. I really appreciate that. And you did, as we say, you hit it out of the park, gentlemen, and I wasn't expecting anything less. I am Dr. Vibe here. I'm the host and producer of the Dr. Vibe Show. I'm also host and co-producer of the Goodman Project show at thegoodmanproject.com, in which Ramon and Khalil contribute, and I'm going to see if I can get Anthony, if he can take a break in his schedule, to also provide some contributions. I also host and produce most Sunday nights the Black Men's Roundtable, Do You Know What Time It Is, at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And finally, I am co-host and producer of the bi-weekly podcast for a White House Proposal for Boys and Men. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed and highly favored. You're a magnet for miracles and your solution for someone's problem. God bless, peace be all, and keep the faith. Follow these gentlemen. They're doing the right stuff, and they're doing great stuff. Take care. Bye-bye.